Welcome back to This Week in Golf on Sauga 960. I'm your host, Chris McKee. My next guest is an attorney and the chief golf law correspondent for Conduct Detrimental, the sports law intersection podcast available on most streaming platforms. I'm joined by John Nucci. John, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for having me.
So let's get right to it. One of the biggest stories in sports is the ongoing lawsuit between the PGA Tour and LIV. First, can you start by laying out exactly what's happening with the lawsuit, just for those who aren't familiar and get a better understanding?
Yeah, of course. So like kind of a 10,000 foot view, we have two separate but pretty related lawsuits going on. First, there's several players who left the PGA Tour to go to LIV Golf. They sued the PGA Tour for antitrust violations, and then LIV was later added to the case. They essentially argue that the PGA Tour has denied them opportunities, attacked their reputation, and threatened them with suspensions, and that all of those actions were in an effort to eliminate competition. And the other side of that lawsuit is that the PGA Tour is suing LIV for tortious interference with their business dealings and contracts. So on that side, the PGA Tour is just arguing that LIV, along with the Saudi Public Investment Fund and its governor, have purposely sought to recruit current tour members and urge them to breach their contracts with the PGA Tour.
So over the past week, there was two significant developments in the case. Can you lay out what those developments are and maybe which side's been affected more, the PGA or LIV, with these new developments?
Yeah, absolutely. There were two pretty big decisions. They both kind of have the same effect. The first one to come down, a magistrate judge denied LIV's motion to quash subpoena requests against the Saudi Public Investment Fund and its governor. In plain language, the PGA Tour wanted to get documents from the investment fund and Al Rumayyan. They relate to certain communications and negotiations, maybe between those officials and golfers they were trying to recruit. They also wanted to pose or interview Al Rumayyan and some other PIF officials. LIV and the investment fund fought those efforts they've been fighting them for like 6 months now. But the judge determined that they do, in fact, need to turn over evidence and sit for those depositions. And then a couple days later, Judge Beth Freeman, she's the one overseeing the case, she granted the PGA Tour's motion to add PIF and Al Rumayyan as defendants in the case. So the reason I say they have the same effect is because now those parties they will have to submit to discovery and sit for depositions. So two separate decisions, but they will have a major impact on the litigation. PIF has appealed the decision. I don't expect it to be overturned. And assuming it's not, I think the Saudis are going to have to decide whether to comply with discovery, ignore it altogether, or try to drop or settle the case.
So you mentioned Beth Freeman, the judge. She's overseeing the case. Just what do you know about her, or maybe her past? Has she been involved in any other high-profile cases of this nature?
Not of sports that I know of. I know she is an avid golfer. Which is interesting. I know she runs a pretty tight ship too. She's pretty tough on the attorneys during their conferences. Seems pretty demanding for timelines and page limits and things like that. There was one high-profile decision she was a part of in 2020. She blocked an executive order of President Trump trying to essentially had to do with training of federal contractors, but she's been a judge for a long time, but she's only been on the federal district judge circuit for about 8 years, which is not a long time. So other than that, I haven't seen many high-profile decisions come down from her.
And is this being done in Florida, in a Florida court? Where exactly is the case being heard? Like, where is Judge Freeman out of?
Judge Freeman is in the Northern District of California, so it's all like San Jose, San Francisco, that type of area.
Why was it placed in that area? Because PGA, I mean, they're in Florida, Washington, D.C. Why is it in California being held there?
That's a good question. I'm not totally certain why they decided to hold it in Northern District of California. There were actually prior PGA lawsuits against the PGA Tour that were also in that district. So perhaps they feel that there's some sort of competitive advantage being in the Northern District of California. I'm not entirely certain why they chose that.
So Chris McKee, joined by John Nucci, an attorney who's been following the LIV PGA Tour lawsuit very closely. So John's a good follow on Twitter. John, what's your Twitter handle? Is it jnucci23?
jnucci23, that's right.
So he's, for those out there, I mean, he's constantly posting updates. I recommend a good follow. So one of the things you tweeted out this week is because of this court case, some of the individual conditions of the LIV players, of their contracts, have been made public. I mean, you went through a whole list of them on your Twitter profile. Can you maybe lay out some of the clauses you found interesting in the LIV players' their contracts to play for them?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of that Twitter thread kind of blew up over the weekend. I mean, the very first one I found interesting that LIV retains sole discretion in the number, location, and dates of events, which may not be too monumental, but that LIV players must play in all of them as a condition of their contracts. LIV has already exercised that right. They increased their events from 8 to 14. And from what I understand, the ultimate goal is to get to 18 events. So that one was interesting to me because so many of the players cited playing less, traveling less, more time with their families as reasons for leaving rather than the money. And then at least some of them turned around and signed on to play, 14, 18 tournaments in 6 different countries around the world. Another interesting restriction is that LIV players must wear LIV team apparel in non-LIV events that they participate in. We'll see what comes of that. I know some LIV players are also required to introduce LIV representatives to their existing sponsors or even prior sponsors to try to facilitate new sponsorship discussions. And perhaps the one that people in my Twitter replies and comments seem to like the most is that players cannot make any false statements or statements that may adversely affect the public image of certain LIV shareholders, which would include the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So I think when maybe players are squirming a little bit at press conferences, if they're asked really tough questions and they don't really seem to have an answer or can't answer, that could very well maybe why.
Well, the only one I've really seen squirm is Phil Mickelson, because he seems to be like, I don't see anyone asking Dustin Johnson these questions or Brooks Koepka. It seems to be all on Phil. You get a sense of that?
I do. And, I made a comment on that a little bit too. It seems like part of the reason that people give DJ a pass is because he is one of the very few that I think came out and was like, yeah, they offered me a boatload of money and I left and I took the money and left. I think it's the guys that cited everything except the money for the reasons for leaving, and then maybe turned around and some of them have maybe signed contracts that are more restrictive. Judge Freeman said that the contracts that they're signing are more restrictive than anything the PGA Tour imagined or something like that. So I think the reason that DJ gets a pass and maybe even Brooks a little bit is because these guys, they kind of threw it out there. Yeah, they gave me a boatload of money and I left, and that's why I left. And I think the problem that other people have, and maybe why Phil doesn't get a pass, is because he talked about kind of everything under the sun except for the money. And if he did turn around and sign a contract like this, then that's a little bit of hypocrisy. But I get it.
Well, I also think Phil's been, and we'll get to a little bit later. I don't want to get too into it, but I think he's been vindicated a little bit in, how much of the changes the PGA Tour's made, and kind of a lot of what he was saying. But I don't want you to jump in yet because we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But you just mentioned, John, the LIV logos on all their apparel when they're playing. The Masters is coming up in a few weeks. And I think that's going to be, that's the big one. How do you see that issue playing out? Do you see, guys rocking the LIV logos at Augusta? Is that going to happen?
I am very excited to see how that one actually plays out. LIV attorneys have said, it was sometime last year, they've said in court filings that their players aren't going to show up in LIV apparel to the Masters, or at least that threat was overblown or something along those lines. But if there are contractual obligations to do so, I mean, we very might well see some LIV crushers or cliques or something apparel at Augusta, which I'm sure they won't love, but it'd probably make a little bit of a media spectacle. But it's certainly not out of the question.
So Chris McKee joined by John Nucci. So John, your website where they can get updates on this case, it's conductdetrimental.com. That's correct? That's
correct. That's our conductdetrimental.com. It's a website. And it's also a podcast. We recorded a podcast episode on this a couple days ago as well too.
So I've been following this case pretty closely, and one of the things I found really interesting is it came out in the court documents just a few weeks ago that, the PGA has been using this, Families of 9/11 or 9/11 Justice group to, they've been showing up to certain LIV events at Trump Bedminster last year to protest, and they've been pushed out on CNN and all these major news outlets as, hey, how can you do this? We're families of 9/11 victims. Well, it turns out that 9/11 Justice Group was created in June of 2022, just at the same time LIV came about, which I found really interesting. One, can you maybe lay out some of the information surrounding that? And I mean, doesn't this really put the PGA in a bad spot? Because it's essentially, it looks like they may have created this group just as a talking point.
Yeah, certainly. There's two ways to look at it. I mean, first, I guess it's possible the organization started at the time because that's when the tour players left to go play for a Saudi-funded league. The other way is that the timing is certainly a little suspect, and there are some undertones to it. I haven't seen a ton of movement on that front since the initial claims by LIV that the PGA Tour was like behind those efforts and those recent court filings, or at least supportive of them. But I think the timing is certainly suspect, and I think it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's crazy because there's been, families of 9/11 groups for, over 20 years, and now there's this brand new one that just came about. I just found that really suspicious, and I think that kind of maybe helped slant public perception a little bit towards LIV. And it did in my view, anyways.
Yeah, and I think that certainly was the goal. And I believe if I remember correctly, back at the time, there was a public relations firm that was at least tied to that group that was also tied to the PGA Tour. So it's probably not a coincidence, and the timing probably isn't a coincidence. But yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything that's going to come through on the legal side related to that, but the timing is certainly suspect.
So Chris McKee, joined by John Nucci, who's an attorney who's been following the LIV versus PGA Tour lawsuits very closely. So I saw you tweet this week about the LIV TV deal with the CW network, which is separate than what we have here in Canada. We'll get into that after, but at least 8 affiliates that are CBS owned are refusing to air it when, LIV was talking about 100% of the CW affiliates are going to air it. Well, now we have at least 8, maybe more. I mean, how do you see that playing out legally with their contract with CW? Is that something that may benefit LIV in the future, where if they get a better deal, they can just pull shoot and maybe use that clause?
Perhaps. I mean, I don't think there's going to be any legal issues necessarily around this. I think at least in a couple of those markets, there were other outlets showing it, so they weren't completely shut out. It was kind of just the CBS owned affiliates that were refusing to show it. The other issue on that front is that obviously the CW was not LIV's first choice, and I think they had to settle for that. I think that's probably fairly obvious. If a lawsuit were to be filed based on that, it would be because of those networks refusing to air. It would have to be filed by LIV. I just can't imagine they're going to turn around and kind of sue at this point the only network that gave them a shot this early into their relationship. But you're right. I mean, it may give them some sort of leverage in future negotiations.
Yeah, when ESPN or someone decides they're ready to jump in, I think that could be, might end up benefiting them. So here in Canada, I'm in the Toronto area. We get it on CHCH, which is basic cable. And I know that's in parts of Western New York where you're located in Rochester. Do you get that channel down in your neck of the woods on basic cable?
So it was on the CW network here in Rochester where I am. So I did watch a little bit of it. I just kind of wanted to see if there was any changes from last year to this year. But it was on at least in the Rochester area on the CW network.
Okay, and we get it on CHH, which we got it last year too, locally, as well as.
That's interesting.
Game TV is also now nationally. So, we were just getting it here in Southern Ontario, but it's now on Game TV as well because we don't get the CW network. But yeah, I've been, I got to watch it quite a bit last year. I enjoyed it. So I was a little bit more on the LIV bandwagon a little earlier. But, John, we talked about some of the schedule changes the PGA Tour has made this past week. And a lot of what they're doing is almost mimicking a lot of the changes that LIV implemented. No cuts now in certain events and limited fields. I mean, all this sounds familiar. Just your thoughts on maybe some of the hypocrisy coming out of the PGA on some of their changes that are mimicking what LIV is doing.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked by that news. At least shocked by the timing of it. The PGA Tour has had so much momentum recently. They're coming off the Waste Management, the buzz of the elevated events and wins in court, and then they kind of dropped that bombshell. I think not only does it kill their momentum, but as you mentioned, they've spent a year bashing no-cut events with smaller fields, and now they're going to have at least a handful of them. I heard today that maybe it won't be as many, but they're still going to at least have a few. I think the other consideration on that front that I'm not sure many people have pointed out yet, but is that it really undermines the argument that LIV shouldn't get official world golf ranking points if all of these events are also going to get them. I mean, granted, LIV has 54 holes. I guess it's a little different, but if the PGA Tour is going to have 6, 7, 8 events with shortened fields and no cuts, and they're all earning world golf ranking points, then it really strengthens LIV's argument for why they should earn them.
So Chris McKee, joined by John Nucci. John, my last question. I'm so thankful for your time here. So, I mean, this lawsuit's been going on. There's a trial date of January 2024, I believe. I mean, how realistic is it that we actually get to see a trial in this, or can you perhaps see any situation where settlements being done in advance, and what would that maybe look like in your opinion?
I do personally, I do not think we get to a trial. I would be very surprised. I think the recent developments that we spoke about, adding the Public Investment Fund and El Ramayan as defendants, and the fact that Judge Freeman she's shown some resistance to pushing back the trial date. So it's really, I think those two developments are really going to push these parties into a settlement. But what a settlement actually looks like at this point is a little unclear, other than each side just dropping their lawsuits. It'll be very interesting to see what the parameters are about any settlement, but I don't think we get to a trial. I think it's even less likely if Judge Freeman does refuse to push the trial date back. So we'll see. I think these two parties are headed for a settlement, but when is your guess is as good as mine.
Awesome. Well, John, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Any closing thoughts? Anything you want to squeeze in before we let you go?
Not necessarily. I appreciate you having me. Appreciate you having me on. I think everybody's a very interesting development. I think the whole case has just been fascinating to follow. And I think everybody should look out for a settlement pretty soon, because I think that'll probably happen before the end of the summer.
Awesome, John. Thanks so much for your time. Don't forget, check out conductdetrimental.com, and you can find John on Twitter. He's a great follow. He's constantly posting updates at the letter J and then Nucci, Nucci, and the number 23, like Michael Jordan. Thanks so much for your time, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.